What's up guys, Andre here, and today I'd like to take a look at a few examples of using container queries. So if you're not familiar with container queries, they are similar to traditional media queries, but instead of responding to the size of the screen or the viewport, they respond to the size of the container the element is in. So this solves the problem of wanting to use the same component in different places regardless of the size of the container they are in. So I'll show you two examples here which will hopefully help you understand better. Now, in terms of browser support at the time of this recording, container queries are supported in the latest version of Chrome, Edge, and Safari. So only Firefox does not have support for it yet, but I think it's coming soon within the next few versions. So once Firefox does have support, I'd be more comfortable using it in production. But for now, you can play around with it within Chrome, Edge, or Safari. So let's take a look at the example project I have set up here. I'm making use of Vue because I think the use cases make more sense when using a modern component-based framework. So this first example has to do with this weather widget. So I have a common two-column layout here, and I have the weather widget within the first column here. So if we take a look at the code, it's within app view. I'm making use of CSS grid here. Main content is the first column. You can see the weather widget being imported here, and I have the sidebar for the other column. And the CSS is all within the component using Vue single file components. So down here, you can see our display grid here. And we're taking the mobile first approach. So on smaller screen sizes, it's one column. And you can see my media query here. So above 800 pixels, it's two columns. And you can see that here. So again, if I were to resize the browser, we have our stacked layout. Now I also have our weather widget, which you can see here. And again, I have a traditional media query, which defines how it looks on desktop. Again, we're taking the mobile first approach here. So if I were to resize the weather widget below 400 pixels, then we get the stacked version. So this is still the desktop version. And below 400, there is the stacked version. And again, we're just making use of traditional media queries. Now, this is what we've been using for several years now, but sometimes we run into this case. So let me just put this back to the desktop version. So say we wanted to use this component somewhere else, but there isn't too much space available. So say, for example, we wanted to use it in our sidebar here. Obviously, we would want to reuse our component here. Say, for example, this actually grabbed the weather from a weather API. We definitely do not want to repeat that code. So we want to make use of this widget again. So let's go ahead and do that. So within our sidebar, we can add the weather widget. So we have it here in the main content. Let's put it within our sidebar. So let me just put it here. And as you expect, it's a bit too cramped here. Now again, we do have that media query in place. So if I were to resize the viewport below 400 pixels or whatever it was, so this is still the desktop version, but below 400, we do get the stacked version. So there is the one in the main content, and here's the one in the sidebar. But what we want is, let me just put this back to the desktop version. We want the stacked version to show up in the sidebar here. So again, with media queries, it only takes into account the size of the screen or the size of the viewport. It does not take into account the size of the container the element is in. And that's exactly the problem that container queries solves. So before container queries, one possible solution would be to pass in a prop, say a size prop, size equals, say, small. And then within the component, we can grab that prop and add the necessary classes for the small size. And that would work, but there's still some repetitive code there, as we already have these styles defined for how the component should look on a smaller size. So we would be repeating code there. So let's just put that back. And let's make use of container queries. So the first step is to identify the containers we want to be responsive. So again, we're no longer listening on the entire viewport. We're listening for certain containers. So in this case, we want this container and the sidebar to listen for changes on the size. So that would be our main content and our sidebar. So within our CSS right here, let's say main content and also the sidebar. We want this to be a container that listens for the size. And the CSS property for that is container type inline size. And you can see VS Code doesn't support this property yet, as it's still pretty new. And there's other values here, but inline-size looks at the width, which is the most common use case. So now these two containers should listen for changes. And now the only thing we have to change is within our weather widget. So here, instead of a media query, So down here to our media queries, instead of listening for the viewport, we're listening for those containers. So we're going to change media to @container instead. And again, VS Code doesn't have support for this yet, so we do get the yellow squiggly, but this should work. And you can also give it a name. For example, if this weather widget was not a child of the actual container, then we have to give it a name in here. But since it is a child, it's just going to find it in the parents, so we don't have to do that. And I'm just trying to keep it simple here. So again, identify the containers you want to be responsive. So in this case, we have 2. We say container type inline size, and then just change your media query to @container instead. And now if we look at the browser, you'll see it's now responding to the size of the container instead of the size of the viewport, which is great. So you can see our weather widget in our sidebar now has the mobile styles applied. And the one in the main content should still work the same way it did before. But now we're making use of container queries. So let me just resize this to show you. So as you see, when it stacks, the container has size for the desktop version. So it's showing that. And this just works like it did before with the traditional media query. So if I resize this down, it should stack eventually. And it does. Awesome. Let's take a look at one more example here. Let me just put this back to the desktop size. And within our project, I'm going to rename this one to app weather for the base component. And let's rename this shopping cart one to our main component. So app.view. Okay. And let me just restart my server just to make sure everything is working. Okay. So let's see what we have here. So we have a shopping cart component, which actually has some logic behind it. So if I were to add a quantity here, this should update. So number of items is currently 4. If I say 2 here, it should be 5. And the subtotal, tax, and total updates as well. And you can also remove items here. And the total updates as well. Let me just refresh that. And of course, we have a responsive version of this cart as well. So if I were to resize this, I believe the breakpoint is 500 pixels, I believe. And you can see we get the responsive version or the mobile version. But again, say we wanted to reuse this component somewhere else in the app, but the container was much more narrow. So for example, we have the main cart here, but I also have this drop down. And you can see I have the shopping cart in there as well, but it's showing the desktop version. And we don't have enough room for that. So we have app. Let me just close this and this. And within our app, we have the main shopping cart in this column. And we also have one for this dropdown, which is right here. So again, we have the same problem as the previous example, where we want this component to respond to the size of the container and not the size of the viewport. So again, if I were to resize the viewport at some point, this is how we want it to show. But we want it to respond to the size of the container. So we can make use of container queries again. So again, pretty straightforward. Identify the containers you want to be responsive. So in this case, we have main content for the main shopping cart. So this one here, and then we have this one here. So this one is called shopping cart container or something like that. Shopping cart drop-down container. So let's go ahead and define these as container queries. So shopping cart drop-down container and main content. So I'll put it right here. Dot shopping cart drop-down container and main content. We want these to be responsive. Container type, inline size. Again, you can give it a name if you like, especially if the components are somewhere else in the DOM. But if they're children, then you don't have to give it a name. Let's save that. Let's go into our shopping cart. And all we have to do is update our media query. So let's look for our media query here. Let's change it to @container instead. And now, hopefully this should work. Save that. And you can see within this dropdown, we have the mobile version, and we still have our desktop version showing in the main one here. And of course, it's the same component, so it should still have all of the functionality of the cart. So for example, if I were to delete an item, this total should update, and it does. So yeah, those were 2 examples where container queries might be more useful than the traditional media query. Again, browser support has become really good over the last year or so, and I would definitely keep them in mind when implementing your responsive designs. Also be sure to check out this site here, which has a bunch of example components that can be practical within container queries. For example, a table, And again, instead of resizing the entire viewport, we just resize the container and the element should respond accordingly. So as it gets smaller, we do get different versions of the table. And for those who are fans of Tailwind like I am, they have a first-party plugin that allows you to make use of container queries. And the syntax is very similar to how you use media queries within Tailwind. And I think I might do a video on that as well. I just have to convert my example here to make use of Tailwind instead. So be sure to look out for that in the next video.